I mean, I've transitioned 6 times. It wasn't just a transition from the military to civilian life. It was multiple times after that. So every time and a transition is a very stressful period for the individual and for his or her family. So you're absolutely right. Generally, we will change jobs 2, 3, 4 times throughout our lifetime. And we go through this cycle where we lose a little bit of that sense of identity, purpose, and community. So yeah, it doesn't just apply to the military when they're getting out of the military and going into civilian life or whatever they choose to do. Chances are they're going to face this multiple times throughout their work life.
What was for you the most challenging transition and why?
Well, I mean, my transition from the military was challenging, and I'll tell you why.
Welcome to Extraordinary Leadership Podcast. My name is Dagmara Asbreuk. I am your host, as usual. Today, I have with me in the studio a very special guest, Howie Cohen, who is joining us from Virginia, from the United States, and who brings a lot of leadership experience, span over military experience, corporate experience, and consulting experience. And what he does today, he is helping veterans to transition into the life after serving. And that conversation will definitely lead us into expanding on the challenges of the transition, as well as various experiences of leadership that he had along the years of experience. And I'm very much looking forward to this conversation and the depth of it. So welcome, Howie, to this show.
Well, I appreciate your having me, Dagmar. I really, I enjoyed the previous conversations we've had. And if I can add anything of value to your audience, I'm happy to share what I know.
Thank you. And, it's one of those occasions that we met actually on LinkedIn. So thank you, LinkedIn, for connecting us. And that's how beautiful it works, right, in a global world today. So Howie, tell us a little bit about yourself and about your journey and what brought you to what you really do with a lot of passion and commitment.
Yeah, well, like you mentioned, I served in the United States military as an officer in the Army, or one of the branches of the military, for about 27 and a half years in various leadership positions, both formal and informal leadership positions. When I transitioned out of the military, I went into government contracting. I spent 8 years there with 2 different companies. One company for 6 years, and then the business unit I was part of got acquired by another company. So I worked with them for 2 years for a total of 8 years. And then I transitioned to a completely different job space where I went into leadership and management consulting with working for someone I'd met and worked with multiple times in the military. And I did that for 4 years. And when that job came to a close, I went into a company for the first CEO of the company I worked with when I transitioned out of the military. He was focusing on how to strengthen mental fitness, and he asked me to join the team to work on the military transition workspace. And so I've been working in both formally and informally in that area for about the last 6 years. So that kind of brings you up to the present.
Thank you. And I think that the word that I mostly, was repeated was transition.
Yeah.
That actually that landed. And of course, the second, mental fitness, which definitely will be talking about something that is also so close to the work I do. So curious, the question here, what brought you actually to do what you do now, to serve veterans? Because along the way, you've been in military, then you've been in consulting, right? Corporate jobs, and now you're serving veterans. So what brought you to that
point?
I
found that even when I wasn't formally doing what I do now, I kind of informally always helped folks that I knew, folks that I served with. Look, when I transitioned out of the military, I had a handful of trusted mentors that I turned to help me kind of plan, prepare for, and execute my transition from the military into the civilian workspace. And so I kind of found myself informally, if I knew of someone who was a friend or someone I served with was planning to get out of the military, I would just reach out to them and offer any kind of advice or guidance or mentoring that they were open to. And so I did that very informally for a number of years after I got out of the military. The last formal job I had, the company was a content creation company. and they created these very discrete channels. Each had a very specific focus, and they had just stood up what they called the Charlie Mike channel, and the focus of that channel was specifically military transition. And when I met with the gentleman who started the company, again, he was the CEO of the first company I joined when I got out of the military. Someone I knew very well, I trusted implicitly, and was explaining to me what he was trying to do. I told him, because I had time. Wasn't working at the time. I told him, look, if I can help you in any way, I'd be happy to help you. And he reached out to me and he says, look, if you're very serious about helping out, I need someone to be the director of the Charlie Mike channel. You have some great military transition experience. That's the focus of this channel. And I think you'd be the right guy to help be the director of that channel. So that put me formally into that space. And then as I developed through LinkedIn, continued to educate myself about the military transition workspace, increased and deepened my network of people who offer help in that space. I found that it became kind of very purposeful for me. One of the things that I learned as I continued to expand my network and my knowledge about the space was specific to the veteran suicide challenge we have in the U.S. military, is that when someone comes out of uniform, they lose three things, and it's a sense of identity, a sense of purpose, and a sense of community. And so, interestingly enough, this space kind of gave me and helped replace my identity, purpose, and community that I had lost years ago, with a new sense of identity, purpose, and community. And I've been in this space now for 6 years, specific to veteran suicide. And I don't remember if we discussed this or not before, but I was actually on LinkedIn one day and I saw a post of a high level senior military officer who had passed, very well experienced, well decorated. He'd served. I'll mention some military terms. I don't mean to lose any of the audience, but he was a colonel, so that's a rank just before being a general officer. And he had commanded a battalion, which is normally about 500 to 600 folks, and a brigade, which could be upwards of maybe 2,000 to 3,000 folks in combat successfully. Was working in a kind of a chief of staff position at an Army post, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and something just didn't seem right. And when I started doing a little bit more research, I found out that he actually had committed suicide in his office, and I didn't know him, but for some reason, it really affected me emotionally. And when I learned about what he did, that's when I made a commitment to do whatever I could to lower the high rate of veteran suicide. The thought in my mind was, if you could have a successful officer who achieved all the things he had achieved, was probably on his way to be a general officer, if he could take his life, what's happening with the younger, enlisted non-commissioned officer corps and young officers, and we have to do something to kind of change this dilemma that we're facing. And that's when I really got focused on the veteran suicide piece. And then I also found out that a poorly planned, a poorly executed transition out of the military is actually the greatest cause for veteran suicide. So it kind of linked two purposeful efforts for me together, and that's how I got to where I am today.
Yeah. And that's really, I can resonate with these three keywords you mentioned, right? Important, most important thing when you lose, you mentioned, right, is the identity, because obviously, yeah, you kind of become attached to that life
Right.
purpose. That's such a transition to a normal life from serving in military and community. Right? It's kind of important elements for all of us to thrive and to have a meaningful life, right, or meaningful careers as well, and be happy as well. And are there any statistics on the suicidal rates in terms of percentages? How many of veterans are committing suicide?
Well,
Let me say
there's a general
returning.
statistic, I'm not even sure it's accurate any longer. Of we lose about 22 men or women a day, and depending on the age range, I think it could go up to close to 40. I think there are a lot of folks who unfortunately take their lives, and it's not reported as a suicide. I'll give you an example,
Mm.
and I don't mean to be too. I don't want to be dark here, but it's one thing when a person takes an overdose of pills of some sort, or unfortunately may die as a result of a gunshot wound to the head. But there are a lot of folks who may just go out, get in their car, and drive themselves into a tree or into a wall. So it's reported as a death, a vehicular death,
Mm.
when actually it very likely could have been suicide, right? So
Mm.
I don't, I'm not even sure that statistics that are delivered through the Department of Veteran Affairs or through the Department of Defense in the U.S. military. I'm not sure they're even accurate, but generally we lose about 20 to 40 folks a day through documented suicide, which
Yeah,
is
that's quite a
staggering when
lot,
you
right?
think about it. We've lost more folks to suicide than we have in combat.
Wow, that's a shocking statistics. So, and you mentioned that the one of the main reason, right, when you were digging into and exploring that territory, which is so meaningful to your past life as well, right, and understanding the context. And you mentioned that you found out that the reason for that was the transition
So
from the
so there's
military or the full support of the transition, right?
Yeah, so as I started developing and deepening my network in this space, one of the gentlemen I came in contact with was actually ran a small team out of the Department of Veteran Affairs that studies and does research on veteran suicide. And so what I shared with you about losing a sense of purpose, identity, and community, and the fact that the military transition is the greatest cause of veteran suicide. And that doesn't mean that combat wounds or post-traumatic stress or traumatic brain injury or other things like that aren't a major contributor. But what his team's research uncovered was that poorly planned, poorly executed transitions are the greatest cause for veteran suicide. If you think about it, I'll just kind of present a little bit of a scenario, right? And I'm going to deal not so much with the high ranking officers or non-commissioned officers, although they still fall into that category. But in the time that I was in the military, I could probably count on one hand the number of folks that when they got out of the military were financially independent. Most were living paycheck to paycheck, month to month. So right off the bat, before you even start the transition process, they're under pretty significant financial stress. If they're married, then they probably have some element of marital stress. If they have children, they probably have some element of family stress. So the stressors are pretty high even before you start the transition process to figure out what you want to do when you come out of uniform. And then add to that the stress of transition. What typically happens is if they have not done a good job of replacing their sense of identity, their sense of purpose, their sense of
Mm.
community, right? And have trouble finding a job, or in a job where it's just a job and it doesn't provide any
Mm.
sense of purpose or identity or community. What happens is they start to self-medicate with drugs or alcohol or both. And so they find themselves in a little bit of a spiral that goes downward. And as time goes on, if they don't lift themselves out of it, they get in so deep into this downward spiral, they don't see a way out and they end up taking their lives. And that's what his research has shown.
And I think these three key elements you mentioned can be applied to all of us, right? And to
In
all
fact,
of the
I
leaders.
wanted. That's a great point.
Yeah.
Because another thing, if you think about it, I mean, I just share with you a little bit about my work history. I mean, I've transitioned 6 times. It wasn't just a transition
Mm.
from the military to civilian life; it was multiple times after that. So every time and a transition is a very stressful period for the individual and for his or her family. So you're absolutely right. You're constantly it generally we will change jobs two, three, four times throughout our lifetime, and we go through this cycle where we lose that a little bit of that sense of identity, purpose, and community. So yeah, it doesn't just apply to the military when they're getting out of the military and going into civilian life or whatever they choose to do. Chances are they're going to face this multiple times throughout their work life.
Absolutely. And it's a, to the listeners, I think is like this moment of reflection. Do I have a purposeful, role, something that fuels my joy and make me feel fulfilled? Is, I think, one of the key questions to so many of us. And some are already lucky to have it or created that, and some might be still actually not having it. The second is community, is the support system. Who am I surrounding myself? Am I in a culture and organization or in community that is supporting me, that is challenging me for helping me to grow, right? And for providing me a safe space and a place that I can actually grow and be myself, right? Or not be afraid to say something. And identity is a big part, because as a person that work with a lot of leaders, and identity is part of our work, because identity is something that of course we can evolve and mold and expand. And this is for me the question of who am I really, right? And when we so often associate identity with roles and with a system that we are at, which is also natural.
Hmm.
Like I remember I was for 13 years, that was the longest time I've been in one organization of three I've served. It was a Japanese organization. And I remember that at the end where we were saying goodbye to each other, that was for me a little dilemma or trauma of drama, not trauma, but drama of identity crisis, because who am I now, right? I felt this belonging to that system, to that culture, to that place. And this is the moment that you're like reshaping and questioning who are you, right?
Hmm.
And peeling that onion, you also start to realize that you are in essence not belonging to any system. But that's a journey to discover and a journey of transformation to really come to the place of discovering your authentic self. And that authentic self can serve in many different situations. So obviously, for any human being that transition, and that is happening all the time, and especially thinking about military folks who has spent more than 13 years, probably like yourself, 30 years, the attachment is very high. So that's, I think, the piece which is the most challenging to evolve, and without support is very, very challenging
Well,
for
and
sure.
especially for the military, because what you find, I'm not necessarily talking about again senior officers or NCOs, because most of them, or at least officers, will have gone through, after they graduate from high school, they'll go to college, they'll graduate from college, and at that point they'll enter into the military. But if you think about a lot of the young enlisted men and women, you know, after they finish high school, if they even finish high school, they'll go into the military, and so regardless of how long they say, that becomes their sole identity, and that's what gives them their purpose, that's what gives them their tribe or their community. And they completely identify with that, with those three things. And it's very hard for them to now shed the uniform and shed those three things and replace them, because it's the only thing they've known. I can't tell you how. So in my last job with Pivotal Moments Media, I also did podcasting, discussing the military transition process. And I can't tell you how many people I talked to, or I knew outside of the podcast that I did, that was their, I mean, serving in the military, that was all they knew. And so it was very hard for them to find that new identity, find that new sense of purpose. But like we said, all of us go through it multiple times, throughout our lives. And this is something we have to constantly work at, because I think we constantly question that for ourselves, right? You were just talking
Mhm.
about that. So I don't care if you're a corporate CEO or uh, um, we all have that challenge of retaining a meaningful identity, purpose, and community. And the community can be, could be a religious community. It could be an athletic, a sports related community. It could be an educational community. It could be doing something in the area where you live, community service. There's
Mm.
so many different ways to attach yourself to a meaningful community. And the more communities you're a part of, the better you're able, I think, to adjust to when changes occur in your life. Because then you have, outside of your immediate, family, you have others that you can turn to if and when you need to talk to someone, right?
Yes. And it fuels nicely those different human needs, because community, and it can be obviously beyond the work space, as you mentioned, is the aspect of a need of belonging.
Right.
right? We have as human beings that need for belonging somewhere and contributing also somewhere and sharing. The purpose is the need for meaning,
Yes.
right? Having a, and it brings me back the book of Viktor Franklin, who was also in Auschwitz in the Second World War, wrote a book about it. Then search for meaning, and the third identity is actually a need of, well, I would say self worth and self value
Exactly.
and self love at the end, because it's all connected with who am I at the core as a human being, when I actually take off all the roles that I'm playing in the life as well. Who am I actually, right? And that is a journey for all of us. What was for you in your period of different many transitions you had? You mentioned, what was for you the most challenging transition and why?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, my transition from the military was challenging, and I'll tell you why. I actually selected a great company to work for with great leadership. The challenge for me was I went into a workspace, government contracting, that I had really no knowledge of, experience in, and so for 9 or 10 months, I was very used to in the military for sure going into an organization, whether serving for the first time or serving, maybe I'd served there before, but within weeks, months of, I felt like I understood what I needed to do and I could bring some level of value. When I went into government contracting, because I was very unfamiliar with the space, unfamiliar with what my role was and how I can contribute, I felt for 9 or 10 months I wasn't bringing any value at all. I had more sleepless nights in that 9 or 10 months than I did ever in
Mm.
the 27 plus years in the military, and that includes, in combat type of leadership roles. So that was a very challenging one for me. Thankfully, because I had such high quality leaders running the company who cared about the people in the company, to include me, they actually hired a consultant to teach me about government contracting and teach me about how I can better serve in my role and how I can bring value. And that helped me kind of get over this challenge, this obstacle that I was facing. But I would have to say the probably the most difficult transition I had was when my job ended with the leadership and consulting firm I was working for. I was working with folks that I had served with in the military, and we were
Mhm.
working with Fortune, not only Fortune 500 but Fortune 50 companies, and I really
Wow.
enjoyed what I was doing because I felt like the methodology that we were sharing with these companies, if we were a team, a consulting team, helping them to improve their capability, I knew the methodology worked, and I knew that if we had the commitment of the leadership of that corporation, that we could make a difference. I liked the people I was working for. I liked the work I was doing. I liked the folks on the corporate side that we were of the team that we were trying to help. And when that job came to an end, they weren't meeting revenue goals, and I got let go because of that. That was a very difficult one for me because I enjoyed so much compared to what I had done in the past. I enjoyed so much of what I was doing that I had a hard time releasing that and letting go of that. And I'm actually not sure I still have completely let go of it. And it's been,
Mm.
what, 6 years now. I mean, that happened in May of 2019. And oh, by the way, so I had three major events occur in my life starting in July of 2018. The first was I lost my mom.
Mm.
3 weeks later, I got diagnosed with aggressive stage 4 prostate cancer, and then in May of 2019, I was let go from the company. And any one of those three things is could be potentially a traumatic event, right? A traumatic situation to
Mm.
deal with.
Mm.
Of the three, the one I had the most challenge with was being let go by that company. So I just losing my mom was certainly traumatic. Being diagnosed with aggressive stage 4 prostate cancer was certainly traumatic. But of the three, getting let go from that position in that company, doing what I was doing, was the most traumatic, and I struggled with that for several years.
Wow. So what made it actually the weight of of difficulty to letting go, right? You mentioned the letting go of that was so difficult. So what do you think made it so difficult?
Well, personally, I think part of it was the way they presented the situation to me. I just don't feel like they were being completely honest with me. And if there was some issue with my performance, and that truly was the reason they let me go, I just wish they would have looked me in the face and told me that, because I offered several different options to them and they didn't pursue any of them. So I just felt like I wasn't being I felt like they weren't being straight with me. I felt like they weren't being honest with
Mm,
me. And again, these are people that I deeply respected. They were senior leaders in the military that I had served with multiple times throughout my career. And I guess I just struggle with the fact that I just don't feel like they were honest with me. And look, at that point, I was kind of seasoned in the civilian world, and certainly in my time in the military, I just feel like there should be total candor and honesty and transparency, and we've got to be big
mm,
boys and girls and handle whatever we have to
mm.
face. And I just wish they had done that. And so I think that's what I struggle with the most.
Mm. Yeah, I can imagine that it kind of evokes the feelings of betrayal, feelings of almost like rejection, although it's very deep subconscious because basically when we don't have that clarity, right? Then we going into many assumptions and we feel a little bit insecure. And I can resonate with that because I experienced that exactly same thing one time in my life. And that was a very, very unpleasant moment. At the same time, a very moment of release because the whole year was building up and was really a very nasty, I would say really, I would call it bullying from, my leader that I had a really previously best relationship as well with. And I remember that, the moment that people just tell you that without disclosing why and telling you, okay, don't ask. And there is a lot of this why, right? This unclarity. This can evoke so many different feelings and deeper, feelings within ourselves. And it's then we seek for understanding it, and sometimes this will not be given to
Right.
us, right? And I think the second what you mentioned, because thinking about various listeners to this show, that actually is a great reminder for any leader who might have a need to divorce with, let's say, with the employee, because well, sometimes it happens that we just don't align right anymore.
Right.
How important is that transparency and that honesty in this conversation? And sometimes it's not performance, sometimes it's basically we not
Right.
align anymore in a way of thinking, in a direction, a strategy, all of that. And if that's so, it's so much, let me say, better to verbalize that and ask how can we basically mutually agree to maybe that's the best way to let it go, instead of playing these nasty different
Right.
games that so many leaders still choose, because that affects another human life. And as you mentioned, it still have some part of it, right, have a very long effect on another human being.
Yeah, just to add a couple things why I felt the way I did. So my immediate supervisor, who happened to be a good friend of mine, he did not agree with the decision and tried to fight the decision, fight the or to change the decision. Lost. There was a kind of our they call it chief people officer or HR, who was also a very close friend and a senior officer that I had served for in the military. He didn't agree with the decision. And then when they and with the way it was communicated to me was we're not meeting our revenue goals, and we're gonna one of the ways we're gonna change that is by letting a percentage of the company go. Well, they actually let four people go, and I was one of the four, and we had over 100 people in the company at that point. So I could understand, letting a percentage of the company go to get, to drive down your cost. But out of 100 people, if you're only letting four people go, it just didn't make sense to me that the revenue issue was the real issue. And right, wrong, or indifferent, that's the kind of the way I was processing it. And that's what I think caused a dilemma for me.
Got it, I understand. Now, what would you say makes a transition successful? What are the key ingredients? Maybe not the whole detailed process, but what would you say make it really successful
Yeah. So,
for any transition?
yeah. Well,
Mm.
and I'm most familiar with the military. Well, let me talk from a military transition point of view, and then maybe
Sure.
some experience with going from civilian job to civilian job. When you're in the military, I think there's several keys that I think that we have individuals have to do better, and as an organization, the Department of Defense has to do better, and that's allowing someone enough time to properly plan and prepare for the transition. That's number one, is making sure that you're
Mm,
starting upstream of of your exit out of the military, and identifying all the things you need to do, the things you need to take care of yourself and your family to ease the stress, right? And there are a number uh, of programs, and there are a number of veteran service organizations that can help you do that. But you also have to have the support of your chain of command to enable to give you the time and the space, and
mm,
to do that. So I think starting early in your planning and preparation process is key. The second is understanding that this is something you haven't gone through before, so finding mentors, finding like a support
mhm,
group, a peer group, and the right other organizations like veteran service organizations that have very good reputations for preparing people to do a good plan, and help them execute. In other words, realizing that it is okay to ask for help, right? I think that's another
mhm,
key. That's
mm,
another key
mm,
thing. And then just committing and taking responsibility for what you're about to go through. I think sometimes folks in the military have a little bit of trouble doing that, because they think because they've achieved a certain rank or they've achieved a certain status in the military, that
mm,
they should just be there. They deserve certain positions on the civilian side. And what they don't understand is that when you work in a corporation or a company, it's a very different focus. In the military, our primary focus was not making a profit, driving revenue, driving up the bottom line of the company, right? And
mm,
plus, you're provided in most cases the resources you need to succeed: people, equipment, processes. A lot is given to
mhm,
you, and you still have to manage that effectively, and you still have to lead people effectively. But it's not like you have
mhm,
to, and you're given a budget, right? And then you just have to figure out
mm,
how you can best execute that budget to achieve your mission and take care of your people. In the corporate space, it's not like that, right? As an employee of a company, I'm a cost to that company. So I have to do
mm,
things that create enough revenue and enough profit to cover my cost, and help
mm,
and actually go above that and help the company achieve a certain amount level of profit or revenue. We're not used to that in the military, right? Because that's not a focus of ours. We're given
mm,
a lot of the resources we need, and you just when I say just, I don't mean to downplay it. You just have to execute well. But in the corporate world, you've got to drive profit, you've got to drive revenue on top of all the things that we
mm,
had to do in the military, and that is a very challenging thing for a lot of folks in the military to adjust to, because many don't have that kind of entrepreneurial kind of
mhm.
approach to things, right?
So basically, what I'm hearing are three things which can be applied really universally to every transition. One you mentioned is the preparation, right? The
Mhm.
planning beforehand. And I think just thinking in a general situation when you are transitioning, right, from one job to another. I mean, when you are planning that, let me say, when you are intentionally wanting to change, I think that planning part is so important. And
Yes,
in this planning, it can be many things. It can
it's
be,
absolutely
yeah,
essential to success to if you want to reduce stress.
absolutely, absolutely. It gives you some clarity. But that's the first, right? So I want to change my role. I want to transition from one company to another. The planning is the first, right? Where do I want? What do I want? And all of these kind of different questions that we will have. And the second, I think, very important you mentioned is the ecosystem, I call
Mhm.
it, right? So the mentors, the peers, maybe even coaches or therapists, whatever is the transition, right? We're talking here about. And it really goes about creating this community as well of support, right? As well as really understanding how to drive that transition successfully, right? Those people are key. And yes, I was smiling when you mentioned that people don't ask. I think it's such the higher you go in an organization, this fear of what they will think about me, and I should know everything, right? He holds so many leaders from asking the question, because it's also an act of vulnerability,
Right.
right? So it's like, wow, what would they think of me? So asking for support is so crucial. And going also for those who have succeeded, right, in any of the transition that you aspire. And I think the third one is about mindset and skill set example, right? Because yes, you come from military to let me see, for example, having a normal job, civil job you mentioned. Yeah, that's a huge game changer on how you think with perception. But it's not different than you are in company A and company B. The culture is different. The mindset is different. The operation model is different. So each time you will need to adjust the mindset or shock the system, whatever is followed, right? And of course, develop certain skills. And where then again, mentors and community play an
Yeah, in
important
fact, you're
role.
kind of reminding me. Even though I stayed in the government contracting space for that 8 year period, six was with one company, two is with another. That what our business unit got acquired by a larger company, and that created a lot of stress for me because they had different processes, different procedures in the company that we moved to. The expectations were a little bit different, and so I struggled with that transition for a period of months. I finally got through it, and kind of got my feet underneath me. But so even staying in the same workspace and having had 6 years of experience in that workspace, when I went to a different company, it was a source of
Mm.
stress and a source of challenge for me, that I had to face and overcome. Right. So no, you're absolutely right. I think to get to the second part of your question, going from company to company, or now the transition from outside the military. One of the things that I think really helped me was, and what you'll learn as you go through the military transition process, is you've got to develop a deep and strong network of folks, and that's where LinkedIn becomes
Mm.
so valuable, right? And because I had started doing that, when I had to go from one company to the other, whether it was through LinkedIn or just reaching out to my network of trusted people, that helped me find the next job. So when I went from government contracting to the leadership and management consulting, number one, I realized I didn't want to do government contract any longer. So I kind of ruled that out as trying to find a new job in that space. The thought of doing something that was much more meaningful and much more purposeful to me was leadership and management consulting. And then I started reaching into my network, and that's what gave me success in all the follow-on transitions, was just
Mm.
reaching out and talking to and seeking guidance, assistance, help from trusted folks in my network. And that's what
Yeah.
I'd encourage people to do. Even when you have a very successful job in a certain corporation, never stop building and expanding and deepening your network. And don't just, and I think the key too is, don't just reach out to them when you have a need. Stay in touch with them,
Mm.
even when everything's going well. Just stay in
Mm.
touch with your network, because you never know when you're going to need to reach out and rely on them. And if you're only doing it when you need something, that becomes very
Mm.
transactional. And I think that
Mm.
I think the potential for violating the trust that you may have developed between you and that other person, it could weaken, right? So, but having a deep and trusted network, I think, is really critical as you transition from one job to another. And I think that's what helped me be a little bit successful in those transitions.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes this network is also, the key to finding or landing another job. So yes, how
Exactly.
important and valuable reminder, right? That nurture these connections not only in times of need. Last thing here, Howie, you mentioned at the very beginning mental fitness. That keyword, landed because that's part of also the way I support leaders. So, what would you like to share about mental fitness and how was the role of it in this whole
Well, I mean, I
process?
think that affects all of us, right? And how well, so if you think about it, we, throughout most of our lives, at least in my life and where I grew up, there was a lot of emphasis put on physical fitness, right? And you knew
Mm.
what you had to do, right? And there's very little focus, there's very little education, there's very little guidance on how to strengthen your mental fitness. In fact, when I was doing the podcast with Pivotal Moments Media, that was actually the last question we would ask any one of our guests: is what do they personally do to strengthen their mental fitness? And got some very interesting
Mhm.
answers. But for me, I know that I'm at my best when I'm, eating well, when I'm exercising well. That I think that helps me with my mental fitness. But I also find that I'm at my best when I'm doing mindfulness or meditative type of training or
Mhm.
exercising, because just like you have to take time and effort to build up your physical strength, your physical fitness, I think it's important to take time to build up and using the right techniques or whatever, you have to work at improving and strengthening your mental fitness. And I think it's probably talked about more today than it was years ago, but I still think it's a
Yeah.
challenge we all face, right? I mean, I still go through periods of highs and lows. And a lot of times I know what I need to do is just making the commitment to do it, right? But I think it's
Mm.
look there if you kind of think of it like building blocks of a wall, bricks of a wall, you have to have
Yeah.
emotional fitness, you have to have financial fitness, you have to have mental fitness, you have to have spiritual fitness. If all those things you're not taking care of each of those areas, the wall is weak and it'll crumble. So
Mm.
that's a lot of what I've learned through my own personal experiences and what I've learned talking to others about some of the challenges they've had. And I know that's
Absolutely.
a passion of yours as well, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's just, it's like beautifully described, this holistic, I call it physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual, right? Well
Right,
being, we can say
right,
as well. Some people call it wealth or abundance. There are many different ways we nowadays describe it, but essentially, absolutely. And there is also a connection between our mental hygiene. One of my clients call it mental hygiene or mental fitness with your emotional resilience, with emotional intelligence is direct linked because the thoughts and emotions are connected. And it's essentially for me, this mental fitness part is essentially taking a driver's seat of your sabotaging your mind, because the mind is always very, very sneaky and there are a lot of negative thoughts
right.
and they are generated at the source. So the faster you can get to really great techniques or tools, as you mentioned, that can effectively and practically support you in it, that's you're gaining in life, you're gaining in leadership, because as you mentioned before, stress is part of every executive and leader role and in life for everybody. But actually, stress is the way we respond to any given situation.
Exactly,
That's the thing. So it's not the stress itself; it's basically how we respond. And the
exactly.
big difference between someone being stressed and the other person not about exactly the same situation lies in your mental fitness, actually, because it's that what shape your perception about the situation and how much triggers you will actually have around that, right? How much stress, anxiety, worry about the situation. So yeah, very, very important part. And maybe on that one, last one is, what would you say is, I've heard you speaking about meditation and mindfulness, so is there something, some special type of techniques that worked for you that can be of value to hear from
Well,
listeners?
I mean, for me, one of the most effective tools I've used in the past, and when I consistently use it, I find I'm much more effective. There's a guided meditation that I found on YouTube that I find very, very. It's actually the law of attraction, right? And I find
Hmm.
when I consistently it's about a 27-minute guided meditation, because one of the things I think maybe it's just easier for me is when I have a guided meditation, I just have to kind of follow what either listen
Hmm.
to or follow what
Yeah.
they're challenging me to do, as opposed to just trying to do it all myself. But that's one tool that I found very effective. Look, the other thing, to be very frank with you, is I think a good physical fitness routine, not just for the sake of what it can do for you physically, But I found, like, for many, like, I don't run anymore, right? I just not at a point in my life where I do that anymore. But I used to find that when because in the military, I had to maintain a certain level of fitness, right? Especially as a leader.
Hmm.
So if I was running a 3, 4, 5 mile run, I would find many times that it wasn't just the physical challenge and overcoming, and
Hmm.
completing the run,
Hmm.
but I found that enabled, for some reason, I would just start thinking about things and maybe problem solve while I was doing the run. So it had a certain mental positive effect on me, as opposed, in addition to having a positive physical effect on me, right? And these are all things. I look, if you're eating high quality, if you have good nutrition, as opposed to, are you eating a lot of heavily processed foods? I mean, that's going to affect your gut biomes, your gut health, which will affect your mental health and how you deal with things, right? You mentioned the word ecosystem. Our This is all part of the ecosystem of being, how to deal with life on a best on a day-to-day basis. So I think they're all connected.
Absolutely. And one fuels indeed another and totally can resonate. That is why whenever there is some imbalance, right? Or you might first affect it, either affects you in overthinking and having, a lot in your worries, and or it affects your health, or if it affects your emotions. But then there are these buckets that which said that are places to check in actually. And you mentioned a very magical word is commitment,
Yes,
right?
that's the
Because I
key,
think we
right?
have access we have everywhere, right? So much access and abundance of information, but very often actually what keeps us not taking the action is the mind sabotage, because we this is the conditioning we are we the tape that is running all
Right.
the time. We don't have time now, is not a good time, I need to do first days, all of that, that is actually already coming from the mind sabotage, that is already taking us from the taking action. And another thing is, yes, who do we then go to? What kind of access we have, and what kind of techniques, like you mentioned, law of attraction, right? That are helping us to channel the mind energy. And because at the end, it's all energy. At the
Right.
end, is mental, physical, spiritual energy that we are as well, and we transpire and fuel us, right? And beautifully said. Howie, this conversation could probably continue for longer because there are so many topics, and I think on the point of transition and the importance, of course, as well, last bit of mental health, there was so much of value for people that are listening. I think I very very much liked that you mentioned about those three critical aspects that are important for every human being. You mentioned identity, purpose, and community. We explored, the three keys, or actually four, because fourth was the network, right, to successful
Hmm.
transitions, which can be handy for so many, because many people are in a job transitions actually in the world at the moment too, right? So it's kind of a good checklist. And also the mental health, right, or mental fitness and the holistic well-being, such an important part for every leader. So thank you very much for sharing your journey, for sharing your wisdom, and being here with me
Well, I
today.
just hope anything that I've shared today, if that brings value to anybody, that's my hope. Because that's what it's all about: is how can we help, not only help ourselves be the best we can be, but how can we positively impact others to maybe be better than they are right now, right? I think that's, whether you want to call it servant leadership, whatever you want to call it. I think we have a
Mm.
responsibility. At least I felt I had a responsibility to not only make myself the best I could be, but how can I help develop, the young men and women who worked with me, around me, for me. How can I help them achieve their personal and professional goals, and how can I help them be the best they could be? So if this adds any value to any of your listeners, I hope it does.
Well, I'm sure it does. And thank you very much for mentioning that. And such a beautiful end as well, to amplify the message and to hear you serving and serving and helping so many leaders out there and so many veterans, right, to actually save their lives. So, such a beautiful mission. Thank you very much for being today here. And to all the listeners, I hope you enjoy that too. And always curious to hear comments and impressions from it. And of course, there will be a link to LinkedIn. You mentioned Howie, so definitely will pop up also the link. That's how it's the easiest, I think, way to connect with you. And wishing you all a fantastic week ahead, and see you the next time.